Hello, everybody. Welcome to class. Today, we are going to be talking about sampling and sampling methods. There's a bit of technical definitions and technical content in this. So I will do my best to provide lots of examples to best illustrate what we're talking about and to help differentiate. This is appropriate for both qualitative and quantitative, but there are some elements where you might actually find them a bit more in the qualitative side. So, with all of that, let's get started. So, when we talk about sampling, basically, it's kind of hard to uh, poll everybody in a given population if you want to find some information, unless that population is quite small. So if we can't grab the whole population, maybe if we can get just a subset of the population, we might actually be able to get information that is just as good, that's a lot less labor intensive. Or maybe we simply don't have access to everybody, but we can get access to a smaller number of people. So when we're talking then about a sample, we want to recognize that, okay, our population is everybody within that particular system or universe, country, wherever. And we denote that usually with an uppercase N, as in number. Okay. And then we have a sample. And so that would be that subset. So maybe if you've got the total population, maybe the total list of all the people in your school, that might be 200 students in an elementary school. And then the sample would be, say, um, maybe five kids from every class. So five times five, 25 students. Maybe you've got two classes per grade. So call it 50 students. That would be our sample size. So n, little case n or lowercase n for would be our sample size. So that would be the subset. And then the element are then the individual people or who are part of that sample. And so maybe the respondents. Although it does not necessarily have to be an individual person, sometimes, we can go higher than that. So we can talk about maybe a family unit or an organization if you're doing maybe more macro or meso level research. But basically, your respondent, that base unit about which you're trying to study. And then this population then is the group about which all of these findings are to be generalized. So we're trying to get a smaller group, but then be able to say, all righty, based on this smaller group, this this is what's happening across the larger group that we can make that claim. So part of this is also then our sampling frame. So for instance, going back to our school example, maybe we've, hopefully the school, in the administrative office, they have a list of every child within their school who is registered to be there. And so if they're like, okay, researcher, come on in, we need to do some research about our students, then that list is going to contain all of the students. So that sampling frame is that technical list. And a lot of times, you're pretty lucky if you can get a full population list, because sometimes it's kind of hard to get a hold of. It requires a lot of trust on the part of the organization that you might be joining partners with. Other times, it's just people out in society, in which case no list may actually exist. So, count yourself lucky, because that's going to make your research a lot easier to be able to conduct. Now, there's also this other, definition here of enumeration units. So these are units that contain one or more elements that are listed in the sampling frame. So perhaps we want to sample some adults. but we go through households to get to them. And so the enumeration unit would be then the household, and then they give us access to the adults. And then we have the sampling units. And so, within this would be kind of the individuals listed at each stage, perhaps of a multiple sampling design. So you could have, a primary sampling unit because you're looking at organizations and agencies. And so you sample maybe 15 different agencies. But then you want to go a little bit deeper. And so maybe you have a secondary unit. And so you start talking to a couple of individuals, a sample of individuals within each organization that then provide information about the agency, which is ultimately what you want to know about. So, you can kind of have it at different levels there. Ultimately, the point of all of this is generalizability. And so we want to be able to understand what is going on. Can we extrapolate all of this to say, okay, here's what's happening in the larger society? So this being able to do this really depends on the quality of the sample. How representative are the people, and how much sampling error might there be? Are there any differences between the characteristics of the people in that I researched and the characteristics of the overall population? So, for instance, if we want to be able to say, here's what's happening among the people in Grand Forks, they have these particular characteristics, but all the data that I have is just from North Dakota all over. Well, you might have a lot of rural perspectives that are going on there that may not actually be representative of Grand Forks specifically, but that's all the data that you had to work with. So that's a big piece of error that you just simply have to say, hey, this was a limitation of my study. And then we've got this cross-population generalizability where you say, well, it works for this population. Can I say that this works for other populations? Can the findings, if we did research in Grand Forks, does this apply to people who live out in the rural areas? Or does it, if we measure the experience of people who are racially identified as white, does it cross over and actually apply and represent then the experiences of people who are racially identified as being black? Huh. So we need to know, all right, to what degree can we make those associations going across different populations as well? So these are important considerations to make. When we assess then diversity, a lot of times when you do research, you will need to have at least a solid paragraph that details what are all of the demographic characteristics? How diverse was my sample group? And so typically you'll give a rundown of saying, okay, this number were female versus male. And if you were able to get, other genders, great. And here's the breakdown in terms of income, in terms of racial identity, in terms of education status, whether they are employed or not, if they are mothers, how many children do they have, all of these different kinds of things that may be of interest to our readers and actually have bearing on our research. So we want to have a representative sample, usually, but not often. And so, when we have this representation, maybe we have, we know within our population that, say, oh, what's that, about 70% are white, maybe about 30%, or yeah, that's less than a quarter. So call it 20% are black, maybe about 15% are Latin Asian or Latino, and then maybe 20, another 19, 18% are Asian. And that we know as part of our population based on the US Census. So we want to have a representative sample. And so we make a very concerted effort that we have then those same proportional breakdowns within our sample to make sure that we have kind of correct illustration from each of these perspectives. According to how they show up. So sometimes you'll hear about a nationally representative sample that might have, say, 500 people from every state to make sure that we have all states that are represented. And maybe, we want to have a corresponding breakdown of all of the racial and ethnic groups and ages, genders, and socioeconomic status proportions within each state. So ultimately, we want a sample that looks like the population from which it was derived. Now, there are different ways in going about this. And, when we, especially when we sample vulnerable populations, there's a lot of ethical issues that are a part of this. And a lot of those ethical issues came out because people did stuff that was not ethical. And so in your workbook, you've got, this vignette of Perry Hudson, who, kind of sampled, prostate cancer stuff from homeless men who had alcohol use disorder. And so basically, they were very vulnerable. They didn't have any, protections. And as a result, you can you can actually say that these folks were abused. So now we have, protections in place where it has to go through internal review board or institutional review board IRB protocols. Somebody else has to review it. We have to, make sure, okay, is there somebody who can consent on behalf of somebody? Are these people being taken care of? Are they receiving treatment in the event that there is an issue? If they're cognitively, unable to make, a clear decision for themselves, is there somebody who can do it on their behalf? Who can actually think through the implications? So, particularly if we're talking about children or people with diminished mental capacities. Prisoners are another one. So a lot of issues that can come up here. And so we want to really be very quite careful in determining how we're doing this sampling. So there's a lot of different types of methods in terms of how you would choose who to pick. How do we determine who's going to be in our sample? How much time do you have? How much money do you have? Those are very practical components that sometimes can actually override, your best laid approaches. So here we've got a big list: random, probabilities, simple random, systematic random, stratified random, cluster. These are all different types of samplings. So we'll explore each of these in turn. So when we talk about then random sampling, this is where we've got, all of the elements, all of our respondents are selected purely on the basis of chance. So we have a degree of probability that we, hopefully can measure of their selection. So, now, interestingly, some mathematics people have found that, for instance, when you're flipping a coin, which should be random, it's actually not random. You've got a greater likelihood of it actually turning and landing on the same side as when it started, before it was flipped. So if it was heads, there's actually a slight increase that it's going to be heads when it lands. So you might not want to actually use that, like physically flipping a coin, but instead use a statistical randomizing program. And there's tons of programs out there that you could use. And it's actually a lot easier and would be much more systematic and be a lot faster as well. Now, For instance, when I was, doing some research, I had a big, large data set, and I actually needed to divide up this data set, but I didn't want to uh, divided up in any way that would actually include some bias. And so I used a random generator and said, okay, I want to divide this into four groups, but I want you to randomly select who is going into these groups. So I divided them into four subsamples for my statistical analysis. And so, one of this issues here is around systematic bias. So there could be additional elements that will influence the chance that could be present in the selection process, such as why, maybe we've got this question of why people do not enroll in a program. Um, but if we only interview people to whom we have access, i.e., those who have enrolled because they're in our program, then you're going to have a hard time actually answering that question, or you're going to come up with answers that may not actually be truly in line with the ultimate reason. Because we've got a hard time finding those who maybe thought about, or maybe they applied but decided not to follow up, or maybe they even declined our admittance. So, um, finding, being able to answer that question, if depending on who we ask, there could be some bias there. And then we've got probability sampling, where we know the probability of how likely it is that somebody will be selected for the sample. So maybe we've got 100 people on our case list, and we know we have 50 men and 50 women who have identified as such. And so we take a sample from this. And so we can calculate and know, all right, what's the probability that a man would be selected to join our sample group, and what's the likelihood that women will be joined, if they've got a 50-50 chance, basically. So we know the probability of selection, and it's not a zero probability, but they actually have a probability. Now, there's several rules of thumb here that go along with this. The larger the sample, so the more people we have that we're conducting our research with, the more confidence we can have that the sample is going to be representative. We also know that the more the same, or the more that the group, the sample, is the same. So if we're talking about white men who are heterosexual and married, and they are this population that we're interested in studying, then the more confidence we can have if those are only the people that we're interviewing, that they are, truly representative. And so ultimately, this fraction of a total population that a sample contains, the percentage does not affect the representativeness unless that fraction is large. So ultimately, the number of people matters more than the percentage. So now, it isn't possible to have too large a sample, because then that can actually skew your analysis, and you can find anything if you want, purely from a statistical standpoint, but it may not actually be practically relevant. And so just really more by chance that you actually found something. So there can be too large of a group. Now, when we're talking then about a simple random sampling, this is where we, use some procedure to generate a number or somehow identify cases based on chance. So, for instance, if we have a data set and we've got this group that we've received from the school or from an agency, maybe we give each person a unique identification number. And so we would then sample based on a random selection from those numbers. So, or we could do a random number, use a random number table, which is Exhibit 5.4 in your book, or you can do like a random digit dialing if you're reaching out, these kinds of things. And so the probability that a person would be selected, it's equal, from one person to the next. Now, when we then get systematic about this, you can kind of get a little bit deeper and more technical. So perhaps we have 1,000 people on our list, and we need a sample of 50 cases or 5%. Okay, so what you can do then is you say, all right, out of these 1,000 people, divide it by the number of cases that I need, or 50. And so 1,000 divided by 50 equals 20. So 20 we then use as our sampling interval, or the nth case. So out of from 1 to 20, so that interval from 1 to 20, say in step two, we then select a random number, call it 17. And then we pick every 20th number as part of the nth case. So every 20th number, we then select moving forward until we have 50 cases. So we would pick 17 as our first one, then 37, then 57. So you keep going up by 20 as the nth case. So this is a way of being a little bit more systematic, but still having a random picking from the cases. Then you've got a stratified random sampling. And so this is where you've got a known population, and so you choose randomly within each group, such as, you've got your population of clients, and then maybe of your clients, you want to, that, okay, some of these clients actually, they share money frequently. So you got to define, all right, well, what's frequent and where are they talking about sharing, and what are we terming as money, or is it in kind stuff? And so you randomly choose from within this subgroup. And so this is kind of like a proportionate type of stratified sampling where you've got a percentage then that looks like the full population. Or you can have a disproportionate stratified sampling where we do an enhanced perspective, which can be really helpful for focusing on marginalized populations. And so what we would do is have an oversample of folks who may not always be included. And so now a point to note here is that you should have at least 10 people in every data category. And so this can be a real challenge for really, really proportionally small populations that's tough to get information about, such as people who have a non-binary gender, or as a portion of a population nationally, the number of indigenous or native peoples. And so unfortunately, a lot of times these populations are left out, or they're simply lumped into a other category. And so we lose the nuance and we lose their perspective. And so what we would want to do then is have this disproportionate stratified sampling where we proactively try and get more of those voices to be heard, to better inform our understanding of an issue. Or if you want to take it one step further, include them in the research process yourself. So, but in terms of sampling, this is one of the issues that we have. Then we've got cluster sampling. And so you can have, 2 or more stages, where you have some random selection of naturally occurring clusters. So a naturally occurring cluster could be a school district or a state or a county, or even a country. So these are natural clusters. Now, notably, you can only have a person appear in one cluster. All right. So you can't be kind of like sitting in 2 different clusters. So, for instance, my mother, she has an apartment now in one state, but she also has an apartment in another state. So if I was to randomly, select both of those states, we would not be able to include her in that analysis, but instead would need to use a different criteria, such as where are you legally a tax-paying resident? What's your primary residence? Okay, in state number 1. So you can only have a person appear in one state. Now, from that, you can then have, say, you can pick 2 random school districts, and then you can have a next stage would then be a couple of random schools, and then from that, a couple of random households, and then from that, a couple of random students. within each of those. So, so kind of grabbing from each, randomly from each cluster. Now, one of the things that we want to ask ourselves is which is the best type of sampling to use? Well, it depends and it's up to you. It depends on the research goals and it depends on what the data is being collected. How are you going about it? Are you trying to get some qualitative insights? Are you trying to get some quantitative analysis out of this? How easy is it to get the data? Or how willing are people to talk? How much time and money do you have? These are all questions that will go into your determination of which sampling method is best to use. So there are other non-probability sampling methods, and a lot of times you'll see these more frequently in qualitative research. So there's the availability, where you have elements simply they're accessible to you. They're of convenience. So for instance, within your organization, your clients, you got access to them. So they're who are available. Then you've got quota sampling. And so maybe you want to sample, you've got a population of genders such as social workers, where maybe 70% of the social workers are women and 30% are men. And so you want a sample in which 70% of your folks are of the respondents are women and 30% are men. Um, if you just do simply a random sampling, you might actually end up getting, more lopsided percentages due to chance. So you may end up with 90% women. Who knows? Maybe the men are just like all on the administrative side and they're not interested in answering surveys. So you want to make sure that, you have to pick them. And so they're not going to be randomly selected. But so you've got to kind of be more purposeful about that. But to the tone of a purposive sample, this is where you've got key people who have identified the information that you need. Maybe this is a white-led agency, and are they meeting the needs of their African American clients? So are you going to talk to the white clients, or you're going to talk to Latinx clients? Oh, you need to talk to the African American clients who are willing to talk. So you have bring a lot of purpose in terms of who am I going to talk to, and I'm not, just simply randomly, determining who I'm going to talk to. I need to be really specific to cherry pick who I need to talk to. Then you've also got snowball sampling, and this is where talking to one person can lead to talking to more people. So maybe you have an interview with one person, and at the end of the interview, they recommend that I interview their friend. All right. But maybe that friend doesn't want to talk to me. We get into some legal issues there. So first, that interviewee needs to get permission and then provide an introduction. So that will always work a lot better when to be able to do this. But then it one person leads to the next, leads to the next, leads to the next. So that's what we mean by snowballing. All right. So when we talk about this non-probability sampling, in order to increase the generalizability, we need to really focus on the typical case, not those who are most convenient to us, because a lot of times they'll be sometimes most like us, and we want to find out what's the experience of people who are different from us. Um, or, looking at the unusual. So, for generalizability, we're looking for what is, going to be the average and the lived experience of most people. Um, and then we also should have different studies in different areas to be able to confirm these localized results. Are they simply, unique to this particular area, or by virtue of that I did research in a rural area, are we finding the same thing in a urban area? Okay, well, we need to do, research both times, in both different types of areas. So, with that, depending on the goal, sometimes, going for the most unusual one is where a lot of times the creative solutions are. And so what made a given case special, and can we replicate it? And that's where we might find the great intervention coming out. But here, in that case, generalizability is not the goal. So depending on what your goal is, that will then depend on who you select. Now, when we talk about sampling distributions, we're getting a little bit into statistics here. And we'll talk more about this when we get into quantitative analysis, but um, you'll want to know, and kind of be able to estimate, what's my sampling error. And so we use inferential statistics, so how likely are we to see the average person in our sample in the larger population? And so we take a look at the sampling distribution. So that might be the statistical value of the mean, or, as well as looking at the sample size. Do we have a larger sample group? And so, we have less error because we had enough respondents. And so, that can be calculated. We also want to talk about homogeneity. So the more similar, if we're talking about, we want to just see what's the experience of that heterosexual white male who's in his mid 40s and is a middle class income, married, two kids, so forth. And everybody within our sample is of that type of, can check off all those boxes. We're going to need fewer people. Whereas if it's a much more diverse sample, we're going to need more people. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that following or coming up. So when we talk about then this inferential statistics, this is really kind of the likelihood where that given respondent will fall within a group. And so, we can calculate that where we simply add up maybe the let's see here. For instance, if you use income level. So we add up the income levels of everybody in our sample, and then we divide it by the number of people in our sample, and then we'll get the mean or the average of that. So this would be kind of the sample statistic. And so this would then be, that average if we are looking at the bell curve, okay, not the outliers, but the one in the middle where it's highest. That would be the most representative of the overall population. So, another way of thinking about it is then maybe how likely is it that all Americans have a financial well-being score of, say, 57, and that would be the average, I think. And this would be, we'd have to also know, well, what's their range? So the range would be then from 18 to 87. Ooh, how about that? I've just had some fireworks. Fun times, fun times. Okay. And so when we determine then our sample size, because we said that, sometimes you have enough. Well, what is enough? How many do I need? How, to prove whatever it is I'm trying to prove, except you're not really going to prove it. You'll say, all right, well, this is what we think it is. So overall, generally, larger sample sizes will decrease our sampling error. And so we conduct a power analysis to achieve this. And so, you know, we can have, we'll do this analysis, and this is a statistical analysis unto itself. Now, basically, the more calculations that you're going to be doing, the more power you need to do these calculations. And so the more people and information you're going to need to pour into that calculation. And so a lot of times, it's you kind of have to strike a balance of, because especially in this very complex and intersectional world, we know that gender and age and racism and, income levels all impact a person's experience and their perspectives and their thoughts and behaviors. And so how many of these demographic variables or, can we add in? A lot of times we call these control variables. Are they relevant? maybe there's some literature out there that says, yeah, these are actually really important variables when we determine a person's mental health or when we determine their financial well-being. Um, and so, how many can we include? Well, every time we include another one, we're going to need more people because then that's one more kind of data point that we're going to be doing some research on, and it has to be sufficiently powered. So the more variables we include, the bigger our data analysis is going to be, and the larger the sample. Also, we can predict stronger relationships, but that will, if we understand, all right, you know what, there's enough research out there, we know, and we're going to be predicting that there's going to be, a really strong relationship here. We're going to need fewer people to prove this, so to speak, than if we're anticipating, say, a weak relationship where it's going to need more power to see and to find out. So, for instance, if we're going to, we know that there's a relationship between a person experiencing abuse as a child and later on having mental health issues. But perhaps there's a weaker relationship between childhood experience of abuse and, say, lower job satisfaction. And so, especially when we have some of those other, kind of outside influences such as education, personality, work environment, type of work that they're doing. So, there's a lot of other things that are going to go on there. And so, as a result, we may need then a larger sample size to be able to accurately measure or test the relationship between childhood experience of abuse and job satisfaction. Now, when we are recruiting people to become a part of our sample, we can beg them, we can pay them, we can subject them. Some of these have differing ethical implications. But one of the things we generally want to do is have some credibility, especially if we are going to be, talking with people in depth. Who are they to open their lives to us and to provide information? So yeah, we'll have to be able to get in good with them. So we can build credibility by associating ourselves with recognized and trusted community members and organizations. Maybe we are talking and become friends with somebody who's known as a leader in the community, and they can provide a lot of introductions to others. And people then they're willing to talk with us as a favor and, to the person that they know and respect. And so it becomes by association. It's also important to use culturally adapted procedures. So you probably, if you're going to be working with tribes, you'll need to go and talk to the tribal leaders first and foremost. Don't just, waltz into somebody's house and say, hey, I'd like to do some research, with you. There are very, very, very important protocols that have to go forth that are going to be very culturally determined. You also need to demonstrate that, the community is going to benefit from this, and you're not just taking information from them. And so, you know, recognize, account for these different barriers and differences. And so, really know a lot and do a lot of research beforehand on yourself, as well as around, just simply understanding who is it that you're going to be conducting this research with. And then ultimately, you've got these implications for evidence-based practice, um, where, you got to understand and be clear, what is the value of this study and how are we executing it? So, you can have um, maybe you've got a food bank, maybe you're seeing the same people coming, week after week. And so you're like thinking to yourself, you know what, if they only had some financial education, maybe they would stop coming because then they'd be able to manage their money better. So here we kind of are, assuming that they have enough money to begin with to keep themselves afloat. So maybe we, subject them to financial education, or maybe they enroll and people have some increased financial literacy, but how do we measure it? And if we just simply measure their financial literacy before the intervention and immediately after the intervention, how much did they learn? It doesn't necessarily show that we're going to have a long-term impact on their well-being and their ability to afford food on their own. So was this the right measure? Did we, execute the study the right way? Did we even measure the right things? You can use a scale, say, that was tested and created with white people in mind, but if blacks are the population of interest, does the tool actually adequately reflect their worldview? And so how is it transferable? So there's a whole science there as well. And so we need to really be very mindful of that and how it is that we're designing these evidence, based practices, and to show that yes, this practice does work across different populations, and it was conducted well. It was conducted repeatedly. It wasn't just kind of cherry picking the best of the best. But we can see that overall, the average or the mean, actually increases, not just a couple of our star rock stars. So, with all of that, thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next video.